We're here to talk about bramble pruning, and it can get a little complicated because there's lots of different ways to do it, and there's different kind of genotypes out there. And so we're gonna kind of review what types of brambles are out there and the plant parts, talk about some pruning and training systems, and then we hope to have a chunk of time at the end for questions. So couple things. There's a lot of brambles out there, and it's a fairly old term, and so we don't hear the term bramble a lot these days, but it is the term we use for things like raspberries, blackberries, and black raspberries. And so a lot of different species in this particular group of plants, and so it can get pretty complicated. There's a lot of hybrids out there and so forth. So a wide range of plants in this group. The ones we're going to talk about primarily are the blackberries, which are related to raspberries. They're not in the same genus as raspberries. And then within raspberries, we kind of break it down into two groups. There's the red and yellow, and they're related. They're the same species. And we have the black raspberries, and they're a separate species from the red and yellow. So black raspberries are different than blackberries. And then we have the purple raspberries, and those are actually a hybrid between the red and the black raspberries. And so the pruning is a little bit different, the management's a little bit different, but as kind of plant breeding progresses, some of the old school definitions between cultivars and types within this are graying a little bit. So a couple of things about difference between raspberries and blackberries. Raspberry, when you pick it, it's hollow inside. The receptacle stays on the plant. So a black raspberry is going to have that hollow inside versus a blackberry does not. And so if you're having trouble differentiating between those two, the blackberries, the receptacle comes with the fruit when you pick it, and the raspberries, it does not. So in terms of where you're at in Iowa, might dictate what you can or cannot grow, or it might dictate how much work you have to do to get them to grow. So the thing when you're looking at some of these catalogs, buying plants, you always got to be a little bit cautious, because at times some things are maybe listed as zone 4 and they might stay alive in zone 4, but the question is, will they fruit regularly, and is your season long enough? So some of these, for example, primocane blackberries, they'll fruit basically anywhere in Iowa. The challenge is your season long enough? So the advice you get is going to vary depending where you are in the state, but generally the farther south you are, the more options you have. And the key thing with all these hardiness zone maps, this is average minimum temperature. So it doesn't mean it can't get colder. It's just the average. And so those are kind of what dictates our cultivar selection. So when you start looking at the fruits, a lot of people like to kind of categorize them by the color of the fruit as to what they are. And that's a little bit of a gray area. The color of the fruit may or may not be a good indicator of what group it's in, because of the black color can be a little misleading. So red and yellow raspberries are the same species, and they have similar management if they're the same kind of genotype. So, but red and yellow are again one species of plant that we kind of group together for management. Black raspberries are a separate species, and they're ones that you commonly see around here on the edge of woods and so forth. They have a little bit more aggressive thorn-like things on them, and they have a little bit smaller drupelets, and so they're a little seedier. Some people like that, some don't. Purple raspberries are kind of in the middle. Depending on the cultivar, some behave more like a red raspberry, and some behave more like a black raspberry. The cultivar I have at home is called Royalty. It's my favorite purple raspberry, and it tends to grow a little bit more like a red raspberry for me. And so I prune it like a red raspberry, not a black raspberry. And then we have the true blackberries, and they generally have very dark fruit. And like we said, the receptacle stays with it when that fruit's harvested. And those are a little bit more questionable throughout all of Iowa. They're a little more prone to winter damage. And so those may or may not work for you if you're doing open field production and you don't want to cover them over the winter or that type of thing. So kind of getting into the botany I already got into. So the red and yellow are cultivars that are raspberries that are related, and they're hardy to Iowa. Black raspberries is a species as well. Hardy to Iowa, and purple is a cross between the black and the red. Get into the blackberries. Gets a little complicated when you get into the blackberries and the blackberry hybrids. There's the boysenberries, the loganberries, the dewberries, and all those. And I personally don't have a lot of experience with them, partially because they're really not very hardy here. And so when we're talking about blackberries in this discussion, we're primarily just going to be talking about the eastern type blackberries that are marginally hardy in zone 5. Zone 6 probably would be best, but we can grow them in parts of zone 5. So kind of biology of a bramble. A bramble is a perennial plant, so the root system is perennial, but the canes are biennial, and I think that's where sometimes people get a little frustrated with that. Is it a perennial plant? Yeah, the plant's perennial. The plant is a short-term perennial. We hope to get 10 to 15 years out of a planting in the commercial world, but the canes themselves are biennial. And so we break it down into 2 terms: primocane. Some people call this the green shoot that comes out or current season's growth. That'd be the primocane. And then the floricane is second season's growth. It overwintered. Some people call it 1-year-old wood because it went through a winter. So depending on the terminology you want to use, those are the common terms out there. And so the plant, if it starts the growing season or starts its life out, starts out as a primocane coming from the ground. If those overwinter and we don't have winter damage, they will send out laterals that they will fruit on generally. And those are the floricanes the second year. And what gets kind of tricky is some cultivars fruit on primocanes and some don't. And so that's where you need to know what kind of cultivar you have to kind of know your management and know how to prune them, because some you can mow to the ground and you'll get a fall crop the following year. Others you'll get nothing. And so you want to definitely know what you have. So I'm going to kind of show you some of my cartoon pictures here in a little bit that help me differentiate between what's a primocane fruiting and floricane fruiting cultivar. But in some of the catalogs, you'll see a summer bearing and a fall bearing / ever bearing. And the main difference is the summer bearing or floricane fruiting ones, they only produce flowers on those floricanes, those 1-year-old canes that overwintered. Now, there's always an exception to the rule. Some years you may get a little bit of fruit on some of these the year before, but by and large, they don't. The primocane fruiting ones will actually produce fruit on both types of canes. It will produce it on current season's growth, so those primocanes, and it will do that in the fall. And it will also produce it on the floricane if you allow that to overwinter. And so I'm going to show you my kind of cartoon examples here that help me kind of explain it. And so if we look at a floricane cultivar, we have 2 types of things growing in it. We have the current season's growth, which is that primocane, and then we have the floricane that we left over from the previous year. In early spring, we'll get some shoot growth. And then late spring, hopefully we don't get a frost, those laterals or fruiting laterals coming off of that cane have flowers on them, and they produce fruit in the summer. And that primocane on the left continues to grow. And in late summer, the floricane will then die, and we should be cutting it out. Once it stops producing fruit, and actually I pull them before that, they might have a few little tiny fruits on them. It's just not worth messing with. You want to get them out because they tend to spread disease. But So we cut those out in the late summer, and then you have these primocanes left over that then overwinter. And then after that winter, they become floricanes and they start the whole cycle over. So floricane fruiting ones is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of doubt what you have to do. You have to have those floricanes. Those fall or everbearing ones, you have management options. We'll talk about that later on, but they produce fruit in two ways. If I retain those floricanes, it will produce these laterals coming towards the base and bottom at the same time as it's producing this primocane. And those fruiting laterals will flower and produce fruit, and that primocane will continue to grow. What differs, however, is that primocane in late summer, early fall, it will not stop growing in a sense. It will pop out these laterals on the tip that will then produce fruit. And that portion of that cane, that tip, will not overwinter. It will die. And so that's why if you have a primocane bearing variety and you allow the canes to overwinter, they will not produce fruit on the tip here because it produced fruit the year before. And so it essentially dies over the winter. And so some people just mow their primocanes down every year to make it easy, and others like to have two crops from them. And it's really a personal decision how you do that. So yeah, they would produce that fruit there late summer, early fall, and then we start the cycle over again. So if we look at the raspberry family, there are a lot of red cultivars that are fall bearing. Some Heritage is probably a common one you've probably heard of. There's some newer cultivars that I personally prefer. Caroline is one, Joan J. There's a whole bunch of other ones have a little bit larger and firmer fruit. There's even a new black raspberry that produces fruit on primocanes that just came out a year or two ago. So when you're looking at the catalogs, again, fall is going to be the primocane ones. The summer raspberries are going to be the floricane ones. And I'm not aware of a purple raspberry that is a primocane bearer, but it's probably just a matter of time until they produce something like that. So other than purple raspberries, you can get all these cultivars in all the different forms if you want summer fruit and fall fruit. So blackberries, they do the same thing. The good and bad thing about blackberries is we have a lot more options in terms of the thorny nature to them. And if you've ever had to walk through a blackberry patch, like in the woods or something like that, they have much more aggressive thorns than the raspberry family. And so thornless cultivars have a lot of advantages, but there's only so many that will survive here. And so we have the same options for blackberries. We have ones that bear fruit on current season's growth, the primocane bearing, and we have ones that bear fruit on only the 1-year-old canes that we overwinter. In Iowa, you probably want to only buy the primocane bearing ones. If we have a year where we don't have a lot of snow cover and they don't have that insulation, there's a good chance that the floricanes on blackberries will winter kill. Now you can lay them down, cover them with straw or something like that if you want to go through that work. But relying on only floricanes in Iowa is a bit of a risky proposition, just because if we have a harsh winter, like this year around, was it January or December 2021, something like that. I live in Mahaska County. We got down like -14, something like that. That definitely hurt those canes, those floricanes. And so with the raspberries, they're probably fine. They can probably handle that. But with the blackberries, you're rolling the dice if you're expecting those floricanes to overwinter every year. I have a home that's 50-50 if they will. And usually anything that was below the snow line survives. Anything that was above does not. But again, it depends on the year. So blackberries, we have the same options. Again, we can crop them for the primocane bearing ones. we have options. We can crop them in the fall on those primocanes, or we can overwinter them and crop them on the floricanes. And so again, that gives you that flexibility. And since you already mentioned that we're a little marginal here in Iowa for blackberries, I would encourage you to only buy those so that you have that as an option. There's a few primocane blackberry cultivars out there. The first ones that came out were Prime Jim and Prime Jam. Prime Jim and Prime Jan. They're getting a little bit difficult to find. They're super thorny, fairly small fruit, and pretty acidic fruit. And so the 4 newer ones are ones I would encourage you to consider looking at. Not all of them have been well tested around here, but the fruit that I've tasted from them is quite a bit better than the Prime Jim and Prime Jan. They were the first ones out, and so they, usually the first ones out aren't always the best because it takes a long time to get the breeding down so they can get all the traits that they want. But since it allowed blackberries to be grown farther north, it was a big help. But I would transition to these other cultivars. I will say you want to check the ripening time of these, because the farther north you get, the riskier it is that fall crop will get dinged by fall frost. So just because it can survive in zone 4, if you have an early fall frost, that can definitely hurt your yield. So that's something to think about. So different kind of training systems and pruning systems and how do they propagate? Well, if you've seen a blackberry or black raspberry plant and seen a row of raspberries, they kind of grow different, and it depends on how they propagate themselves. Raspberries, red raspberries, propagate through underground rhizomes. And so when we plant red raspberries, you plant them, X amount of feet apart, they will fill in that row. And in a couple of years, you won't be able to tell where your plant started because those underground rhizomes spread. On the other hand, blackberries and black raspberries, they stay as kind of a crown for the most part. They will spread a little bit. And so we tend to allow the red raspberries and yellow raspberries to spread within the row. And the blackberries and black raspberries, those plants stay more as a crown. And so they do grow quite a bit different from that perspective in terms of how you're going to prune them and that kind of thing. And I'll show you some pictures later on. So sorry to mention this, but the red and yellow, all the red and yellow raspberries, be it primocane or floricane, they spread through underground rhizomes. The black raspberries have those crown buds that those plants stay kind of more tight. So trellising options we'll talk about here towards the end, but for me personally, I would have a permanent trellis on all of them. But if you're not overwintering canes, you're just fruiting on primocanes and fruiting on those tips in the fall, you don't need a very extensive trellis. I personally prefer a permanent trellis either way, just because when I build something temporary, it's super temporary and usually not that great. And so for me personally, I would have a extensive or a permanent trellis on all these, but that's just me personally. So one of the big differences in the bramble world is what do we do in the summer? And this is where blackberries and black raspberries diverge from the red and yellow raspberries. The red and yellow raspberries, we do not want to pinch or cut back in the summer. We want one long cane to keep growing and growing. And I know that bothers people sometimes because they can get 7 feet tall or what have you. But do not tip the red and yellow raspberries in the summer. If you tip them, they will produce lateral shoots, and they don't produce well on those lateral shoots. So we want a single cane coming from the ground, not tipped for red and yellow raspberries. So don't tip them. If you want to shorten them in the winter, you can. I'm going to discourage you from doing that too much, and I'll explain why here in a little bit. The blackberries and black raspberries, on the other hand, is the opposite. We want to pinch them because they produce more fruit on those laterals than if you let them grow straight. And some people pinch them as well because it keeps the plant short and it's more likely to be covered with snow for a good part of the winter, depending on your winter and where you live. So black raspberries and blackberries, we pinch them. And different sources say different things, anywhere from 2 to 3 feet. Once those primocanes get to 2 to 3 feet, you're going to pinch them and want those laterals to grow out. Again, don't do that with red and yellow raspberries. And I know I've repeated myself over and over again. That's where there's a big divergence. So here's an example of a black raspberry. It got pinched in the summer, in fairly early summer, and those laterals grew, and that's what we want for the black raspberries. The red ones and yellow do not. Purple raspberries, it just depends on the cultivar. Like I've said before, some grow more like red and yellow raspberries, some grow more like black raspberries because they're a hybrid between the two. I would say most grow more like the black raspberries, so when in doubt, treat them like that, tip them. My personal experience with the one I have is the cultivar Royalty, and I've had better luck with not tipping it, but it looks more like a red raspberry than a lot of other purple raspberries do. So now we're in the winter time, and we're talking about red and yellow raspberries. You can go ahead and shorten them then, but I'm going to caution you, don't shorten them by more than 1/4. 70% of that yield is coming from the middle of this cane. And so if I shorten this by more than 1/4, you're severely cutting into your yield. Yeah, you can remove the top quarter and you're going to lose a little bit of yield, but just from the logistics of keeping that plant in its place and not having to flop over, fit the trellis, and sometimes the tips die just a little bit. By all means, you can tip them back in the winter once they're not growing and gonna branch like we don't want them to, but don't go any farther. And I see a lot of people cutting them back pretty hard, these red raspberries. I see a lot of people pinch them in the summer. That's definitely not what you want to do. And so if you get nothing from this presentation, that's one of the things I'm gonna probably repeat again. So all right, so if I have primocane raspberries and blackberries, I have options. So if I only want one crop, a fall crop from these primocane ones, so it would be like Heritage is a primocane red raspberry. Fall Gold is a primocane red raspberry, and the Prime Jim, Prime Jam, Prime Art Traveler are the primocane blackberries. I just want one crop, just mown to the ground in the winter, and you'll get that fall crop. There's some different debates on if you get a higher yield by doing that, or if it's the same yield. And I've seen a lot of different numbers that go back and forth on that argument, but it simplifies pruning, and it probably helps you with disease as well by doing that, because those canes, when they overwinter, they're probably going to have a little more disease carryover. So some people like to have a primocane raspberry patch and a floricane raspberry patch. The primocane ones, they just mow to the ground, so they get a fall crop from there. The floricane ones, they do their more detailed pruning on. Again, you can crop those primocane bearing ones as floricanes. It's just you're not going to get the full yield because that top part for the year before. So if that makes sense. So if I'm looking at these primocane raspberries, blackberries, whatever, again, just mow them down and as close to the ground as you can get them. So some people use a lawnmower is a little aggressive, might be a little hard on the lawnmower, or pruners. If you have one of those trimmers with metal blades, whatever you can do to get them to the ground. Again, that makes it real simple for management. So here's just an example of that. Again, as close to the ground as you can get them. And you can do that really anytime in dormant season. I generally just wait till March or something like that when the ground's frozen. I'm not gonna rut up anything, and but yet before everything breaks bud. So, and then they'll pop out like this, and again at the end of the season you'll have that fall crop just in that top point. And really, we don't do any detail pruning with these primocane varieties. We might mow to narrow up the row so it doesn't get too wide. But since we're not going to carry these over next year, we don't have to worry about overcrowding them and thinning them out. We're just basically mowing enough so we have, we have a distinct row. We don't want just a mass, but just keep the rows narrow, but we generally just let all the primocanes fruit. So that's simple. It's very simple. And that's why you can have a very simple trellis, like something like this. It doesn't have to be very sturdy because these canes aren't being overwintered or anything like that. So you can see they mowed them to the ground. So the floricane ones, it's a little more work, and that's why some people choose to have two patches. But regardless, in late winter, early spring, we're picking the good canes, we're eliminating the poor quality ones, and reducing the number, period. And then we have a second step of pruning in the summer, that once those floricanes die, because they don't live more than like a year and a half, we got to remove them. And so it's another step that if you're doing the primocane ones, just mow them down. You don't have to do that. But now if you're doing these floricane ones, you get a summer crop. And I would think for most home gardeners where you're space limited, you probably want both. But a lot of commercial people choose to crop them, have a primocane crop and a separate floricane crop and manage them separately. But again, depends on how much space you have. If space is an issue, I would probably encourage you to buy primocane bearing ones and fruit them for both of those seasons. So here's the floricane red raspberries without a trellis. Basically, we want to narrow that bed up to a foot and a half. And that's another thing I see a lot of people just let them creep wider and wider. That shade is not good. We need to get sunlight inside there. And then for every linear foot a row, we remove the smaller canes, and we want about 3 to 5 per foot. So we got to narrow it up. You can do that with a lawnmower or one of those metal weed trimmer type things pretty quickly. But the thinning of the canes to that 3 to 5 per foot, that takes time and skill that you can't just do it mechanically. So it takes a little bit more work for these. And this is what happens. We overwintered them, and then next spring, these fruiting laterals pop out, and we get the fruit in the summer there. So lots of different ways to trellis these as well. I would encourage you to tie, if you're doing floricane fruiting, tying them to the wire, to some type of wire. However you choose to do it. This is a T-type trellis, because once these canes get loaded with laterals with fruit, they get very top heavy. So if you don't tie them to something, they have a tendency to slide over. And once that fruit is on the ground, I mean, it's prone to rot and who knows. So I would encourage you, if you're doing floricane fruiting, to tie those floricanes to something, because they get quite top heavy. And a lot of people like to have a type of T-trellis like this, or some people do it as a V. And this way the floricanes are tied to the outside to make picking easy. Then as those primocanes are growing, they're in the middle. So you kind of spatially separate them out. You just wedge them all into, 2 wires between a 6-foot post, just running wires around a 6-foot post or 6-inch post. You're smushing all those inside there, and it gets a lot trickier to pick. And some pests like spotted-wing Drosophila, those little fruit flies that are annoying, they love those congested shade areas where there's just a thick, massive canopy. And if you're going to treat for them, you need to get some air movement in there, some spray penetration in there. So I would encourage you to tie floricanes to something because yeah, it doesn't seem like they're that heavy now, but our goal is to get a ton of fruit on them, and that makes picking easier too. Personally, I like to use just regular old twine. There's a lot of different plastic things you can use, but I don't know. You end up seeing cutting that off, and then someone ends up on the ground, just becomes a waste issue. So I just like the regular old twine, like you see in this photo for my personal choice. It's cheap, it's biodegradable, and so forth. So I already mentioned the T trellis as one option, and that's a pretty popular option. And basically, you have a post horizontal, and again, we're tying the floricanes to that, and the primocanes are growing in the middle. Some people prefer more of a V trellis, might have a little more cost because you're buying two posts. You just take two posts, angle them like so. You could probably get by with metal T-posts if you have them, not too far apart in the row. And it's the same concept. We're tying the floricanes to those so that they're on the exterior of the canopy, easy to pick, and then the primocanes grow in the middle. Definitely need some type of end post assembly. I mean, I'm always amazed, driving by and seeing people's grapevines or brambles or what have you. You think you got those posts in real good, but there's a lot of pressure pulling these posts inward. And so there's lots of different ways to do it. You can put an earth anchor in the ground. You can pound a post in the ground, but some type of, if you have a row of any substantial length, say 50 feet or more, you need some type of thing to help pull those end posts from bending in. And you can do a web search of that. There's an H-brace, there's the tieback system, there's several systems. It's annoying because you have to mow around it, but my perspective, it's worth the work, because otherwise your end posts start to bend it. So here we are getting into the picking season, and you can see here we have our primocanes popping out here. That's going to be next year's crop. We have our floricanes with that rough bark, so that's a way to tell them apart. The primocanes have the green, more succulent growth. The floricanes have that rough bark, and these are starting to get the tail end of the season. And so, again, once they're done fruiting or close to when they're done fruiting, cut out those floricanes, even if they're still have green leaves on them and so forth. You can already kind of see they're starting to die off a little bit, the leaves. That's a sign that they've completed their life cycle. Get them out of there and just haul it out of the area. You can let them go till you pick every single tiny little piece of fruit on there, but the longer you let them hang on there, the smaller the fruit gets. And again, at some point, you gotta just ask yourself if it's worth it to keep maintaining them. So we talked about how black raspberries and blackberries tend to stay in clumps because they don't spread really through underground rhizomes. So here we can actually see this is where the original plants are planted, and little crown buds come from the base of these plants. And so it's a little bit different pruning. Instead of just saying for red raspberries and yellow raspberries, 3 to 5 canes per linear foot, here we generally plant these plants somewhere around 3 feet apart, give or take, and we keep about 3 to 5 canes per plant. And you can see that they're originating from the base of that plant. So a very different look from, these are black raspberries, I believe, than the red raspberry. They don't fill in that row. And you can see also that these got tipped in the summer. So got tipped in the summer, so they have these laterals growing on them. And that's our goal. We want those laterals. Now, this photo is showing these after they've been pruned. They probably had about a dozen canes coming out, and the laterals are probably twice the length of this. And so the additional step we do for these is, we thin them down to 3 to 5 canes per plant, but we also shorten these laterals a little bit. If you leave these laterals be the foot or 2 feet long or 3 feet long that they are, a lot of the fruit produced on the tips of the laterals is much smaller and is going to hang closer to the ground. And so we tip those plants in the summer to force the laterals for these black and purple raspberries, and the same thing with blackberries. But also when we winter prune, we prune back the laterals to maybe a foot or something like that from the main part of that cane. So these are looking like nice plants. They got the 3 to 5 canes, got their laterals trimmed back, and again those floor canes are attached to something. And for me, I personally would use a wire trellis on this, but you don't have to as much because these plants are contained to this one crown area, so you don't have canes all spread out in a mass. So you could do something like this for these. For a red raspberry or yellow raspberry, this would be a little bit maybe trickier. I guess you could still do it that way, but I'd prefer more of a tier V trellis for the red or yellow raspberries. So here's just showing that in a diagram. Can we pinch these once they got 2 to 3 feet, give or take, during the growing season, because we want the black raspberries to pop out laterals. Those laterals got long. And then at dormant pruning, we thin the canes down, shorten those laterals to 8 to 12 inches, give or take. And the height you prune it really is up to you. A lot of people prune blackberries a little bit shorter than the 36-inch to 48-inch that you see here, just because they're trying to get a lot of those canes to stay below the snow line. So just more photos of the same thing here. So there you can see the tipping to get those laterals to grow. So here's the main cane, here's the lateral, and then the lateral itself got shortened. And there's the growing season. So before that. So with blackberries, it's pretty similar. Those plants stay in a crown, and we thin them down to 4 to 6 canes per plant, give or take. We pinched them in the summer, and now we have these laterals. So I guess the way I've generally told people is the easy way to remember is the black fruited plants, so black raspberries, blackberries, we kind of treat the same. I know they're different species of plant, but we pinch both of those and we thin them down to 3 to 5, 4 to 6 canes per plant at pruning, and we cut back those laterals at pruning. So black raspberries and blackberries have very similar pruning management. So if that kind of simplifies it, that's a way for some people to remember it. So I think I'm gonna move ahead to just show some more photos here, just so you can kind of see it, and then we'll open it up to some questions here. So here's a blackberry plant, and you can see on the left-hand side, it got tipped, real aggressive laterals. We went in, thinned out for the strongest canes, and shorten those laterals. And what some people also do is they will remove the laterals from the bottom foot of these canes. So it's kind of hard to compare the two photos, but what I personally do is, if there's a lateral coming from 6 inches on the ground, I remove the whole thing because that fruit will just be hanging on the ground. And so that's an additional step that some people will do. They don't like to pick the fruit off the ground. It gets dirty, it gets stepped on, and so forth. So if you can buy thornless blackberry cultivars, I would encourage you to consider that because they are thorny. And I can't say that I've ever picked blackberries on thorny blackberries and not drawn blood at some point. Just they're that thorny, especially some of the cultivars, like at least my experience with Prime Gin and Prime Jam, they're very thorny. And so, red raspberries, some cultivars are a little thornier than others, but they're not super aggressive, but blackberry stems, if you have the option of buying a thornless cultivar that is hard area, and that's the kicker. There aren't a lot of hardy ones for our area. It's a huge difference. You can see on the left hand side here the thornlessness on it. It's worth it. So that's something to consider if you are on the fence on which cultivar to choose. Definitely go thornless for the blackberry side of things.